The day after Walker found the watch, he found Clarence Smith's overcoat in a storm buggy. The deputy sheriff, searching the barns and outbuildings with a flashlight, had seen it and thought it belonged to the new tenant. Kept warm by the coldness of lap robes, Clarence Smith had spent the night before the murder on his own farm, and in the morning concealed himself behind a haystack and waited for Lloyd Wilson's lantern to come bobbing across the pasture. Cletus's grandfather, when he was interviewed by that same reporter, said that if his son had committed the murder while mentally unbalanced from jealousy, he wouldn't be found alive. He wouldn't want to live. Cletus's mother, perhaps too distraught to be charitable, said, "I do not believe he killed himself. I think he carried out plans for his escape." What plans? There is no evidence that he had made any. Partly out of fear, and partly to get away from curiosity seekers, Walker and his wife moved into temporary quarters in town. The sheriff's office was kept busy answering calls from people who wanted to know if Clarence Smith had been found. Most of them had heard that he had drowned himself in the gravel pit. The Courier-Herald was at some pains to scotch this rumor also. Deputy William Duffy, who conducted a thorough examination of the gravel pit the morning of the murder, does not believe that Smith or any other person drowned himself in the pit. The earth around it was soft due to the thaw. On two sides of the bank was steep, and tracks would have shown clearly. At the point where it would have been possible to dive from a springboard, the water was shallow, and a person would have had to wade out in the shallows before reaching deep water. Encircling the entire pit, looking for tracks in the soft earth, Mr. Duffy found absolutely nothing. On Friday the 3rd of February, 15 days after Lloyd Wilson's body was found leaning against a partition in his barn, another body was fished up from the bottom of Deer Creek gravel pit, where the deputy sheriff said it couldn't be. It was lying face down across the dredging bucket. Cletus's father, not wanting to live, had shot himself through the head. Dangling from his right wrist at the end of a shoestring was a .38 caliber revolver with 2 empty chambers. A flashlight protruded from his coat pocket. A strand of baling wire was wound around his neck and waist. Until it was severed by the dredging bucket, it had attached the body to whatever the heavy weight was that was holding it down. In going through the other pockets, the undertaker found a razor still deeply stained with red, a bloody handkerchief, a watch chain, and several shotgun shells. At the coroner's inquest, the only witnesses were the sheriff and the 3 men who worked at the gravel pit. The jury returned the following verdict: "We, the undersigned jurors, do find that Clarence C. Smith came to his death by a gunshot wound inflicted by his own hand with suicidal intent. There was no effort to establish a motive for the suicide, and no mention of the murder of Lloyd Wilson. At the final hearing in the murder case, the verdict was death from a gunshot wound inflicted by an unknown hand." Several hundred people tried to get a look at Clarence Smith's body while it was at the undertaker's and returned away. The funeral was in his father's house. Reverend A.S. Hubbard, pastor of the First Baptist Church, was in charge of the services. A male quartet, standing on the stair landing, gave a number of selections. Pallbearers were Joseph McElhinney, John Holmes, Frank Mitchell, and Roy Anderson. Numerous floral tokens of sympathy were received by the family, and the funeral was one of the largest held in Lincoln in some time. Cletus's father was not buried at the crossroads with a stake through his heart, but in the cemetery along with everybody else. The day after the funeral, a gun stock was found floating on the surface of the gravel pit. The following afternoon, the dredging bucket brought up the rest of the gun. In the barrel was a defective shell. When the shotgun failed to go off, the shell jammed and the ejector didn't remove it. And so Lloyd Wilson was killed with a revolver instead. Cletus's grandfather was summoned to the sheriff's office to identify the gun and said he knew his son had a shotgun, but he didn't know what it looked like or remember having seen the gun among the things his son brought with him when he moved from the farm. The sheriff then asked if Clarence Smith's sons hunted with him. Identification of the gun, I'm quoting from the Courier-Herald, was made this afternoon by the oldest son of Clarence C. Smith, who recognized the manufacturer's mark. The boy has a bicycle of the same make. Between the time that Cletus and I climbed down from the scaffolding and went our separate ways, and the moment when he was confronted with the broken gun in the sheriff's office, he must have crossed over the line into maturity, and though he is referred to as a boy, wasn't one any longer. Shortly after this, his mother wrote to Lloyd Wilson's housekeeper, asking that a photograph she had given him be returned to her. The Courier-Herald got hold of this letter and published one sentence from it. I am the most miserable woman in the world. Chapter 4. In the School Corridor. I have a hazy half-recollection, which I do not trust, of sitting and staring at Cletus's empty desk at school. Somebody, I think it was my grandmother, said his grandmother came and took him away. It cannot have been true. He had only one grandmother, and she was living right there in town. What probably happened is that his mother kept him out of school, and when she left Lincoln, he went with her. I didn't wonder what the evening paper meant precisely when it said that Cletus's father had accused his mother of having been intimate with the murdered man. I wouldn't at that age have been so innocent as to think it meant they were on friendly terms with each other. When I thought about the matter at all, I thought about the ear, which was never found. I knew it was a most terrible thing that had happened to Cletus, and that he would be forever singled out by it. But I didn't try to put myself in his place, or even think that maybe I ought to find out where he lived and get on my bicycle and go see him. It was as if his father had shot and killed him too. The carpenters and plumbers and electricians finally stopped getting in each other's way and left the new house entirely to the painters. I came home with white paint on my clothes, and my father suggested that I stay away from Park Place until the paint on the woodwork was dry. He was exasperated at the architect and at himself. If the concrete foundation had been sunk 2 or 3 feet lower into the ground, it wouldn't have required a great many loads of expensive topsoil to bring the lawn up to the necessary level. The day we moved in, Grace, overtired, dropped the bottle of iodine she was putting in the medicine cabinet of the upstairs bathroom, and it fell into the washstand and broke. She and I spent our first evening in the new house scrubbing at what looked like bloodstains on the shining white wall. The house was too new to be comfortable. It was like having to spend a lot of time with a person you didn't know very well. And I missed the way it used to be when there was no roof yet, and the underflooring was littered with shavings and bent nails and pieces of wood I could almost but not quite think what to do with. Now there was nothing on the floor but rugs, and you couldn't do daring things because if you did, you might leave a mark on the wallpaper. My father was always away during the middle of the week. My little brother spent 2 or 3 days at a time with my grandmother, who idolized him. And so Grace and I were often alone together. The people who lived in the houses all up and down the street were either related to her or her close friends. They were in and out of one another's houses all day long, and several afternoons a week they sat down to bridge tables. Expertly shuffling and reshuffling cards, they went to work. Auction this was. Contract bridge hadn't yet supplanted it. Once, looking over Grace's shoulder, I saw her make a grand slam in clubs when the highest trump card in her hand was the 9. The women serenely doubled and redoubled each other's bids without ever losing their way in the intricacies of some piece of gossip. And the one who was adding up the score was still able to deplore, with the others, the shockingness of some new novel that they had all put their names down for at the library. 14 was when boys graduated into long trousers, and since I hadn't yet arrived at that age, I was still wearing corduroy knickerbockers. When I couldn't stop reading A Tale of Two Cities, I put my long black cotton stockings across the bottom of the bedroom door so my father wouldn't see the crack of light and come in and tell me to go to sleep. I had a 1-tube radio set in my room on the desk where I studied. Above it, on the wall, was a map of North America with colored pins for all the radio stations I had picked up. The pin that gave me the most pleasure was stuck at Havana, Cuba, which I got only once. My ears hurt from the headphones, and my feet were cold all winter long. My room was on the northwest corner of the house, and the hot air registers didn't do what was expected of them. And once something happened that was so strange I couldn't get over it. I heard Eggie Reinhardt, 2 blocks away, call his mother to the telephone. The radio set had picked up his voice out of the air. But how? From the telephone wires? Nobody could tell me. When I came home from Scout meeting, the aerial on the roof showed faintly against the stars. Before I walked into the house, I left the front walk and went and peered through the crack of light between the drawn shade and the sill of the living room window. I wanted to make sure that my father and Grace weren't having a party. The word had undergone a sinister metamorphosis. Originally it meant ice cream and molds, and other children arriving with presents for me. Or if it was a grown-up party, then the best linen tablecloth and place cards, and little paper cups full of nuts, and a centerpiece of cut flowers from the greenhouse, and more spoons and forks than usual. During Prohibition, it came to mean people getting together for the purpose of drinking. Gossip made it sound worse than it was. There were limits. But I didn't know what they were, and therefore assumed that there weren't any, and that if the parties were not orgies exactly, they were in that general area. Among Grace's friends were a handsome, raven-haired woman who had a year or 2 before lost her husband, and a humorous, unmarried woman who worked at the bank. They were both at our house a good deal, and my father referred to them jocosely as his harem. I knew that they weren't really, but what was I to think when I heard them laughing about how Lois went upstairs and took off all her clothes? At my mother's parties, people didn't do such things, and came down, wrapped in a bath towel, and did the hoochie-coochie dance. Anyway, I didn't want to blunder into something like that, so I looked before I walked into the house. After a short while, all this, I now think, rather jolly behavior had stopped. It was merely a manifestation of the times, and did not reflect their true personalities. They settled down into something like the ordinary quiet life of most married couples. Grace could whistle like nobody's business, and I have a vivid memory of her rendition of "Here's to the heart that beats for me, true as the stars above. Here's to the day when mine she'll be, here's to the girl I love," as she made her way backwards down the stairs with a dust mop. It is like a still from an old movie. She never gets to the bottom of the stairs. In the remaining 10 years before I took off for good, she was never impatient with me, and I don't think I was ever rude to her. There was enough self-control in that household for 6 families. Unlike the wicked stepmother in the fairy tales, she had a gentle nature and could not bear any kind of altercation. And it was not in her to wrestle like Jacob with the angel until I stopped being faithful to a dead woman and accepted her as my mother. Instead, she chose the role of the go-between. When my older brother had a Saturday night date and wanted my father to let him have the car, he enlisted her aid and wrote off with the car keys in his pocket. Grace's mother lived directly across the street from us with her son Ted, who was at that time a bachelor. Mrs. McGrath was a stately, warm-hearted old woman, much looked up to by her children. Grace's brothers were jovial, exceedingly kind men who, together, on next to nothing, had started a sand and gravel business and been successful. They loved to tell funny stories, and whenever they were gathered together, there was the sound of laughter. They also confused me by treating me as if I were a genuine relation. I didn't so much hold out against them as proceed with caution. In that insufficiently heated bedroom on the northwest corner of the house in Park Place, I was taken by surprise by the first intimations of a pleasure that I did not at first know how to elicit from or return to the body that gave rise to it, which was my own. It had no images connected with it, and no object but pure physical sensation. It was as if I had found a way of singing that did not come from the throat. I stumbled upon it by accident, and it did not cross my mind that anybody might ever have had this experience except me. Therefore, I did not connect these piercing, exquisite sensations with the act of murder that removed Cletus Smith from Lincoln, or with what other men and women did. It was all right for them to do provided they were married, or even with what older boys talked about in the locker room at school. It was an all but passive, wholly private passion that turned me into 2 boys, one of whom went to high school and was conscientious about handing in his homework, and tried out for the glee club and the debating society, and lingered after school talking to his algebra teacher. The other boy was moody and guilt-ridden, and desired nothing from other people but their absence. When I was in bed, with the light out, the 2 boys became one, and I thought about the aerial on the roof, and how the cold air above our house was full of unknown voices and dance music from a radio station downtown, and from stations in Springfield, and Peoria, and Bloomington, and Danville, and Chicago, and Kansas City. In college, I read Shakespeare's The Tempest for the first time, and was reminded immediately of what went on over the house in Park Place. My father was offered a promotion that meant he would work in the Chicago office of the fire insurance company and be home every night, like other men. At his age, he didn't want to travel from one small town to another and be at the mercy of railroad timetables anymore. Also, he was ambitious and gratified that they wanted him. My stepmother could not bear the thought of leaving Lincoln and her family and her friends. Night after night she wept, while she and my father talked behind the closed door of their room. After a few years, she could say that she preferred living in Chicago, but she was never again as light-hearted as she was before they left Lincoln. The move to Chicago came in March, but I stayed behind to finish the school year. I was taken in by old Mrs. McGrath. Her house had only 2 bedrooms, and for 3 months, Grace's brother Ted and I slept in his room in twin 4-poster beds. One would have thought that having the company of a schoolboy was the one thing hitherto lacking in his very agreeable life. At night he took off his toupee and hung it on a bedpost, and as we were undressing he imparted his favorite words of wisdom to me, such as, "Marriage is what takes the giggles out of the girls," or "You can't make a man mad by giving him money," or "All little things are nice." In the morning before school, we all 3 crowded into the breakfast nook off the kitchen and ate buckwheat cakes and maple syrup. I persisted in feeling that I was putting them to a great deal of trouble when I don't suppose I was, actually. When it was time for me to go to Chicago, Ted and another of Grace's brothers drove me there, stopping on the way to inspect a gravel pit in Joliet. They checked in at the LaSalle Hotel in Chicago, and we had dinner. As I stood gaping at the coffered ceiling, the like of which I had never seen before, they stuffed $10 bills in my pockets. I didn't know whether it was right for me to take the money or not, and tried not to, but they assured me it was perfectly all right, my father wouldn't mind, and in the end I took half of it. Instead of using the elevated railway, as I expected, we drove all the way from the Loop to Rogers Park in a taxi so I could see the city. As I looked out of the window at Sheridan Road, they looked at me and were so full of delight in the pleasure they were giving me that some final thread of resistance gave way, and I understood not only how entirely generous they were, but also that generosity might be the greatest pleasure there is. Home was now an apartment on the 2nd floor of a 3-story brick building. The apartment house was a block west of Sheridan Road in a quiet neighborhood, and Lake Michigan was only a short walk from where we lived. There were still lots of big, old-fashioned, single-family houses with front porches and trees and some sort of lawn and a home-like look to them. My father found a job for me in his office as a filing clerk, and he and I went to work together on the L. In the evening, the boys used to cluster on the sidewalk with their bicycles, and I would walk by them with a dry mouth and my eyes focused on something farther down the street. I usually ended up at the lake, where I sat on a rock pile, looking out over the water. This went on for most of the summer, until one evening I found my way blocked by a bicycle wheel. The boy who was astride the bicycle asked if I was Jewish. It was not anti-Semitism. He was just curious. The circle opened and took me in. I mean, I could stand around with them, and nobody objected to my being there. After Labor Day, I started to school. In a city high school of 3,000 students, where there was so much going on after school: band practice, fencing, the stamp collectors club, the history club, the French club, the players, the orchestra, the camera club, the chess and checker club, the architectural society, and so on. The failure to do well in sports didn't make you an object of derision. Once, in an outdoor gym class, a football came through the air and I managed to hang on to it. This was long after the class had stopped expecting me to catch anything, and there was general rejoicing and disbelief, but they never rode me. I was accepted for what I was. It was, after all, not a small town, but a big city, and in that school there was no one who was not accepted. The school building was of gray stone and enormous. It was 10 times as big as the old, overcrowded, yellow brick high school in Lincoln, and the classrooms I had to go to were sometimes far apart. One day during the first week or so of school, as I was hurrying along a corridor that was lined with metal lockers, I saw Cletus Smith coming toward me. It was as if he had risen from the dead. He didn't speak. I didn't speak. We just kept on walking until we had passed each other. And after that, there was no way that I could not have done it. Why didn't I speak to him? I guess because I was so surprised, and because I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what was polite in the circumstances. I couldn't say, "I'm sorry about the murder and all that," could I? In Greek tragedies, the chorus never attempts to console the innocent bystander, but instead, sticking to broad generalities, grieves over the fate of mankind, whose mistake was to have been born in the first place. If I had been the elderly man I am now, I might have simply said his name, or shaken my head sadly and said, "I know, I know." But would that have been any better? I wasn't an elderly man. The bloodhounds had never been after my father, and I didn't know, how could anybody know, how many times has such a thing happened to a 13-year-old boy, what he had been through, any more than a person who hasn't had a car door slammed on his fingers knows what that is like. Boys are from time to time found hanging from a rafter or killed by a shotgun believed to have gone off accidentally. The wonder is, it happens so seldom. I think if I had turned and walked along beside him and not said anything, it might have been the right thing to do. But that's what I think now. It has taken me all these years even to imagine doing that. And I had a math class on the second floor clear at the other end of the building, and there was just barely time to get there before the bell rang. Chapter 5. The Emotion of Ownership. Until I was 6 years old, my father kept a carriage horse, and on hot July evenings we would leave the house on 9th Street and go driving to cool off. Sometimes the couple who lived next door would be invited to go with us. My brother sat in the front seat between my father and Dr. Donald, and I sat in back between Mrs. Donald and my mother. The dog, though we all shouted, "Go home," at him, went too, trotting between the wheels of the carriage with his tongue lolling out. No matter what street my father chose to drive out of town by, the landscape was much the same once we got out in the country. Plowed fields or pasture, all the way to the horizon. There were trees for the cattle to stand under in the heat of the day, and the fields were separated from each other by osage-orange hedgerows that were full of nesting birds. The conversation in the front seat of the carriage was about what was growing on both sides of the road: corn, wheat, rye, oats, alfalfa. The women, blind to this green wealth, talked about sewing and receipts, the word they used for recipes. I was of an age to appreciate anything that looked like something it wasn't, and when we passed a cluster of mailboxes, I would turn and look back. Long-legged wading birds is what they put me in the mind of, though we were a considerable distance from anything that could be called a body of water. Dr. Donald owned land near Mason City. The 80-acre farm that my father might have inherited had, to his undying regret, been sold by my grandparents. Living carefully and putting aside half his salary, he had managed to buy a farm, but it was a little too far away to drive to in a horse and carriage, and since he couldn't look at his own land as he would undoubtedly have liked to do, he enjoyed looking at other people's. With a gesture of the whip, he would direct Dr. Donald's attention to a large and well-built barn, and they would be moved to admiration. By nature home-loving, I looked at the houses instead. How bleak they were compared to our house in town. No big shade trees, no wide front porch to sit on, no neighbors all up and down the street. If there were flowers, they didn't amount to more than a few dusty hollyhocks or some nasturtiums growing in a tin basin on a stump. Suppose Cletus had come to spend the day with me when we were small children. There would have been a dog following us around, and in the barn a horse, a high carriage with red wheels, hay, bags of oats, etc. But then he would have discovered that I had never harnessed the horse to the carriage, and that we couldn't ride him bareback to round up the cows because there weren't any. The house was a lot larger and more comfortable than his, and there was a sandpile in the backyard. But what was a sandpile compared to the horse barn, the cow barn, sheds, corn cribs, the chicken house, the root cellar, the well, the windmill, the horse trough, and the swimming hole? In town, there were cardinals and bluebirds and tanagers and Baltimore orioles, but he had the mourning dove, the forever inquiring bob white, the hoot owl, and the whippoorwill. My father sold the horse and carriage and tore down the barn and built a garage to put the new 7-passenger Chalmers in. And after that we could drive to Mount Pulaski, where his farm was. Tagging around after him, I became aware of the richness that wasn't visual but came from the way the smells were laid on. Dried out wood, rusting farm machinery, the manure pile, the pig pen, yarrow, onion grass, quick lime from the outhouse. In spring, the frost leaving the ground. In summer, the hay lying cut in the fields. All things considered, I doubt very much if Cletus would have been eager to change places with me. The black, fertile soil of Logan County was, and so far as I know still is, owned by people whose ancestors came from Kentucky or Indiana or Ohio, bringing with them no more than they could fit into a lurching covered wagon. They staked out as much land as they had a fancy to, and cleared it slowly, putting a few more acres under cultivation each year. Their children and grandchildren, born on this land, felt they belonged there. Their great-grandchildren either sold their patrimony or got someone else to farm it for them. Living in town, quite comfortably, in big old houses set well back from the street, they kept an eye on what was going on out in the country. And when the crops were delivered at the grain elevator, they took, as was customary, half the profits. They did not consider a tenant farmer their social equal, any more than a carpenter, or a stonemason, or a bricklayer. The farmer who owned the land he farmed, they could and did accept. When Cletus and I were playing together, the question of social position didn't come up, and neither did it come up on the school playground. It was something that descended upon people when they were older. The names on the mailboxes that claimed my attention when I was a small child were proof enough that the tenant farmers were of the same stock as the townspeople who looked down on them socially. Their forebears had perhaps come on a later wave of European migration and found that land was no longer plentiful at $1.25 an acre. Or they could have been hamstrung by some family misfortune, or simply lacked the talent for rising in the world. Roaming the courthouse square on a Saturday night, the tenant farmers and their families were unmistakable. You could see that they were not at ease in town, and that they clung together for support. The women's clothes were not meant to be becoming, but to wear well, to last them out. The back of the men's necks was a mahogany color and deeply wrinkled. Their hands were large and looked swollen or misshapen, and sometimes they were short a finger or two. The discontented hang of their shoulders is possibly something I imagined, because I would not have liked not owning the land I farmed. Very likely they didn't either, but farming was in their blood, and they wouldn't have cared to be selling real estate or adding up columns of figures in a bank. On the seventh day they rested, that is to say, they put on their good clothes and hitched up the horse again and drove to some country church where, sitting in straight-backed, cushionless pews, they stared passively at the preacher, who paced up and down in front of them, thinking up new ways to convince them that they were steeped in sin. If I knew where Cletus Smith is right this minute, I would go and explain, or try to. It is not only possible, but more than likely, that I would also have to explain who I am, and that he would have no recollection of the moment that has troubled me all these years. He lived through things that were a good deal worse. It might turn out that I had made the effort for my sake, not his. I don't know where he is. It isn't at all likely that we will run into each other somewhere, or that we would recognize each other if we did. He could even be dead. Except through the intervention of chance, the one possibility of my making some connection with him seems to lie not in the present but in the past, in my trying to reconstruct the testimony that he was never called upon to give. The unsupported word of a witness who was not present except in imagination would not be acceptable in a court of law. But, as it has been demonstrated over and over, the sworn testimony of the witness who was present is not trustworthy either. If any part of the following mixture of truth and fiction strikes the reader as unconvincing, he has my permission to disregard it. I would be content to stick to the facts, if there were any. The reader will also have to do a certain amount of imagining. He must imagine a deck of cards spread out, face down, on a table, and then he must turn one over. Only it is not the 8 of hearts or the Jack of diamonds, but a perfectly ordinary quarter of an hour out of Cletus's past life. But first I need to invent a dog, which doesn't take very much in the way of prestidigitation. If there were cattle, there had to be a dog to help round them up. In that period, I don't know how it is now, farm dogs were usually a mixture of collie and English shepherd. The attraction between dogs and adolescent boys can, I think, be taken for granted. There is no outward sign of trouble in the family. The two farms are both on the right-hand side of the new hard road and have a common boundary line. The Wilson house, with its barns and sheds, is next to the road and an eighth of a mile closer to town. To get to where Cletus lives, you have to drive up a narrow lane that has a gate at either end of it. When it is almost time for Cletus to come home from school, the dog squeezes herself under the gates and trots off up the road to the mailboxes, where she settles down in a place that she has made for herself in the high grass, with her chin resting on her 4 paws. These mailboxes, too, are on posts and look like wading birds. In the very few years since my father disposed of the horse and carriage, there has been a change in the landscape. It is now like a tabletop, the trees mostly gone, the hedges uprooted in favor of barbed wire, resulting in more land under cultivation, more money in the bank, but also in a total exposure. Anyone can see what used to be reserved for the eye of the hawk as it wheeled in slow circles. If a farm wagon or a Model T Ford goes by, the dog follows it with her eyes, but she does not raise her head. She is expecting a boy on a bicycle. The tenant farmers, whose names are on those mailboxes where the dog lies waiting for Cletus to come home from school, apply the words of the Scriptures to their own lives insofar as they are able, including the commandment to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And they cling together when they are in town, largely because they cannot imagine a situation in which the people they see in the stores or on the sidewalk, and who do not appear to see them, could possibly need their help. It is different in the country. The bicycle is painted a bright blue, and Cletus has only had it for 3 months. When he first saw it beside the Christmas tree, his heart almost stopped beating. On rainy days he walks to school rather than have it get old and rusty, like the other bikes in the wooden rack at the side of the one-room schoolhouse. With the dog loping along beside him, he pedals for dear life over the final stretch of road. The dog waits each time until he has closed the gate, and then she trots on ahead importantly, as if by himself the boy wouldn't know the way home. Scratching hens have destroyed the grass in the farmyard, and the house could do with a coat of paint, but the roof doesn't leak, and the barns are not about to fall down. The dog follows Cletus up onto the porch, leaving her neat footprints wherever she has been. With her head cocked, she watches while he puts his school books beside the door and bends down to untie his shoelaces. His head is now on a level with hers. The plumed tail wags seductively. He leans forward so that she can smell his breath, and smelling hers wrinkles his nose with distaste. Phew! What have you been eating? Dead fish? Dead something. There is no telling how long she would let him go on, looking into her agate-colored eyes. Forever, possibly. She has made him a present of herself, and nothing he does or doesn't do will make her take it back. "Good dog," he says, and steps out of his shoes. The dog knows better than to try and sneak into the house with him, but that doesn't mean she likes being kept out. She withdraws her long, pointed, sensitive nose an inch at a time, allowing the door to close. Then she whines softly, inviting him to relent. Let us consider the kitchen the dog is not allowed into. Steam on the windows, zinc surfaces that have lost their shine, wooden surfaces that have been scrubbed to the texture of velvet, the range with 2 buckets of water beside it, ready to be poured into the reservoir when it is empty, the tea kettle, the white enamel coffee pot, the tin matchbox on the wall, the wood box, the sink, the comb hanging by a string, the roller towel, the kerosene lamp with a white glass shade, the embossed calendar, the kitchen chairs, some with a crack in the seat, the cracked oilcloth on the kitchen table, the smell of octagon soap. To the indifferent eye, it is like every farm kitchen for 100 miles around, but none of those others would have been waiting in absolute stillness for Cletus to come home from school, or have seemed like all his heart desired when he walks in out of the cold. When Cletus stands by the pasture fence, an old white workhorse comes, expecting a lump of sugar and possibly hoping to be loved. Anyway, Cletus loves him. And rounding up the cows, rides him in preference to any of the other horses. And when he has tears to shed, he does it with his forehead against the horse's silky neck. In the daytime, the sky is an inverted bowl over the prairie. On a clear night, it is sometimes powdered with stars. Coming home from school, Cletus often sees Mrs. Wilson and the 2 little boys out by the clothesline. Risking a fall, he takes both hands off the handlebars and waves, and they wave back. It is not by accident that Cletus is often in the Wilsons' buggy when the 2 families drive off to church together or to town to see the fireworks on the 4th of July. They are his second family. If his mother sends him to the Wilsons because she has suddenly discovered that she's out of vanilla or allspice, there's a good chance that Mrs. Wilson will cut a slice off a loaf of bread that has just come out of the oven and spread butter and jam on it and give it to him. He likes her apart from that, though. He likes her because she is always the same. When it was time for him to go to school, the Wilson girls showed him the shortcut through the fields to the other road and the one-room schoolhouse, and Hazel had to tell the teacher his name. With all those strange boys and girls staring at him, he lost the power of speech. The teacher was young and pretty, and showed him how to hold a colored crayon. If Cletus wants to know something, and his father isn't there to show him, he goes looking for Mr. Wilson, who doesn't lose patience with him if he fails to get it right on the first try. When Mr. Wilson says to Cletus's father, "I saw a cock pheasant crossing the road this morning. I don't suppose you feel like taking the afternoon off to go hunting." It is understood that, providing it isn't a school day, Cletus will go with them. His mother was afraid and wanted him to wait until he was older, but Mr. Wilson said, "Better for him to learn now while he hasn't got a lot of other things on his mind. Here, boy, you hold it like this, with the stock against your right shoulder, and you keep both eyes open and sight along the barrel to that bead. If you obey the rules that your father tells you, and don't go out with some fool who's never had a shotgun in his hand before, you can't get into trouble. Sometimes he rests his hand on Cletus's shoulder while he is talking. At such moments, Cletus feels that no matter what he might do, even if it was something quite bad that he had to go to jail for, Mr. Wilson would see a reason for it and stand by him. Not that his father wouldn't also, but Mr. Wilson is somebody Cletus isn't even related to. In that flat landscape, a man cursing at his horses somewhere off in the fields can be heard a long way. All sounds carry. The dinner bell, wheels crossing a cattle guard, the clatter of farm machinery. When the gasoline engine sputters and dies, or the blades of the mowing machine jam, Cletus knows that Mr. Wilson, a quarter of a mile away, has heard it, and is waiting for the sound of the engine or the mowing machine to start up again. If it doesn't, he leaves his own work and comes across the pasture to see what the trouble is. With their heads almost touching, his father and Mr. Wilson study the difficulty. Wrenches and pliers pass back and forth between them with as much familiarity as if they owned their four hands in common. In midsummer, with thunderheads blotting out more and more of the blue sky, it could be his father's hay that they are tossing up onto the wain, or it could be Mr. Wilson's. They know, of course, but it is beside the point. When the haymakers no longer cast a shadow, it means that the sun has gone under a huge, ominous, dark gray cloud. A breeze springs up, and they work faster. They don't even so much as glance at the sky. They don't need to. The precariously balanced load grows higher and higher. When the wagon won't hold any more, they climb up onto it and race for the barn, and with the first raindrops pattering on the oak leaves, they congratulate themselves on getting the hay under cover in time. This happens not just once, but year after year. So far as Clarence Smith was concerned, no other man had ever shown a concern so genuine or so dependable, and he did his best to pay it back in kind. When Lloyd Wilson had a sick calf, instead of calling the vet, he got Clarence to come and look at it, and Clarence stayed up all night doctoring the animal and keeping it warm with blankets. In the morning, Cletus woke up early and threw the covers off and dressed and ran all the way to the barn where they were, and got there in time to see the calf struggle to his feet. His father said, "I guess that's that," and brushed Mr. Wilson's thanks aside, and they went home. And when his father gets behind in his spring plowing because of the rains, Mr. Wilson joins him after supper with his horse and plow, and together they turn over the soil in the lower 40 by moonlight. Cletus thinks of it as their lower 40. Actually, it's someone else's. Land, barns, sheds, farmhouse, everything but livestock and machinery, belong to Colonel Dowling, whose snub-nosed Franklin is often parked by the entrance to the lane. The crops that are planted and the price at which they are sold await his decision. The lightning rods on the roof of the house and both barns are his idea. It is right, of course, to put your trust in the Lord, but in moderation. Things that people can manage without his help, he shouldn't be asked to take care of. After the time that Franklin got so badly mired in the lane that his tenant had to come with a team and pull him out, Colonel Dowling doesn't put his entire trust in the Franklin either, but tells himself it is just as easy to leave the car by the side of the road and walk in. He is a self-made man. His father was a hod carrier who drank more than was good for him and fell off a scaffolding and broke his neck, leaving his widow with 6 children to bring up. She did it by taking in washing. As Ed Dowling fought his way up in the world, he married a woman with money and made himself into a gentleman. It was no small accomplishment, but it cut him off somewhat from his brothers and sisters, who were not above making fun of him behind his back. A gentleman doesn't have one set of manners for the house of a poor man and another for the house of someone with an income comparable to his own. He never enters the farmhouse without knocking, even though it is legally his, and he remembers to wipe the spring mud off his shoes. He also makes a point of asking Cletus's mother if she is satisfied with the present arrangements, and this could lead to, if she thinks the kitchen needs repainting, his offering to supply the paint. He is always courteous to her, and he knows the boys' names. If that is all he knows about them, it is not greatly to be wondered at. One farm boy is very much like another. The cat has invariably got their tongue. Satisfied that his tenant's wife is a good housekeeper, he shows no interest in the second floor, and therefore doesn't know about the broken-back copy of Tom Swift and his flying machine that is lying open with the pages to the floor, in the fluff under the bed, in the small room on the right at the head of the stairs. Colonel Dowling is older than Cletus's father and has snow-white hair, and Cletus finds it natural that when they stand talking by the pump, or when they walk over the fields together, his father calls the older man Colonel, and Colonel Dowling calls his father Clarence. But sometimes the Colonel brings a friend with him, somebody from town who doesn't know the first thing about farming. And with Cletus's father standing right there, he would say, "My corn," or "my oats," or "my drainage ditch." If he says it often enough, Cletus drops behind out of earshot. Even if his father, after working these acres for 12 years, doesn't feel the emotion of ownership, Cletus does. Another card from that same pack. His brother Wayne, who is 8 years younger than he is. Wayne and Cletus are as different as day and night, people say, or to put it differently, as different as the oldest child and the second one often are. Watching his mother as she holds Wayne's chin in her hand and parts his hair with a wet comb, Cletus remembers that she used to do this to him. All the way home from school there are clouds racing across the sky, and the air is warm and humid. Wayne is sitting on the porch steps when Cletus rides into the yard. He has pulled a strawberry box apart and is making an airplane of the pieces of thin wood. As Cletus steps over him, he bends down and tries to take it from him in order to make an improvement, but Wayne jerks it back. "Aunt Jenny is here," he says. "Somebody gave her a ride out from town, and we're having strawberry shortcake for supper." Except for Jenny Evans, who is her mother's sister, Fern Smith has no living relatives. Her mother died when she was 3, and her father gave her to Aunt Jenny to bring up, and went out west, where he found a job on a cattle ranch in Wyoming. From time to time he sent money, never very much. Now he is dead too. So is Tom Evans, Jenny's husband. As people get older, they get more alike in character and appearance, and could all be leading the same life, or almost. Shut up in the little house opposite the fairgrounds, Aunt Jenny talks to the hot water faucet that drips, and the kitchen drawer that has a tendency to stick. She also sings, hymns mostly, in a high, quavering voice. That old rugged cross, and art thou weary, art thou sad? And how glorious must the mansions be, where thy redeemed shall dwell with thee. Without meaning to, she has grown heavy, but she eats so little that short of starving to death, there doesn't seem much she can do about it. Sometimes she goes out to work as a practical nurse and comes home and sits by the kitchen table soaking her feet in a pan of hot water and Epsom salts. When she gets into bed and the springs creak under her weight, she groans with the pleasure of lying stretched out on an object that understands her so well. The face that passes in and out of the small unframed mirror over the kitchen sink is that of an old woman whose chin has hairs on it, whose teeth spent the night in a glass of water, whose glasses are bifocal, causing her to step down into space if she isn't careful. She is full of fears, which are nursed by the catastrophes she reads about in the paper. The front and back doors are locked day and night against bad boys, a man with a mask over the lower part of his face, pneumonia, a fall. There is, even so, something buoyant in her nature that makes people pleased to see her coming toward them on the street. And usually they stop to talk to her and hear about the catastrophes. She winds up the conversation by saying cheerfully, "Life is no joke." What sensible person wouldn't agree with her? The house is her one great accomplishment. Against all odds, she has managed to hang on to it. It's a poor man's house, she loves to say, and not much to look at. It doesn't do to brag about your possessions, especially to people who have less. The mortgage is paid off, and she doesn't have to take in roomers. It is all hers, meaning the pollarded catalpa tree by the front sidewalk, the woodshed around and back, the outside sloping cellar door, and the porch light that doesn't turn on, meaning also the white net curtains that have turned gray and are about ready for the rag bag, the 9x12 linoleum rug in the front room with the design worn completely away in places, the ugly golden oak furniture that could be duplicated in any second-hand store, Sir Galahad and the dicky bird and the smell of the kerosene heater. The two upstairs rooms are hot in summer and expensive to heat in winter, and so she doesn't use them. The big double bed, all but blocking the front door, makes the front room look queer, but she has stopped caring what people think. She means to die here, in her own house, in this very bed. Meanwhile, she is not alone in the world. From the fairgrounds to the first fence post of the farm is a little over a mile. And when Aunt Jenny is feeling blue, she puts on her hat and coat and, armed with grape jelly or a jar of pickles, pays them a visit. She tries not to come too often, and she is careful never to take sides between husband and wife. Blessed is the peacemaker, for he shall inherit the kingdom of heaven, see God. She can't remember offhand, and keeps meaning to open the Bible to Matthew 5 and see which it is. Clarence is kind to her and brings her fruit and vegetables that she cans and lives on all winter. Fern is in the habit of leaving Wayne with her when she goes to the stores, and used to do the same thing with Cletus when he was small. "Come and give your old auntie a kiss," she says now when Cletus appears in the doorway. "I know you don't like to kiss people, but it won't kill you. Not this once." "It's going to rain," he says, and either his mother doesn't hear him, or else she failed to connect what he has just said with the washing on the line. He goes on upstairs and takes off his school clothes and hangs them on an already overcrowded hook. The room gets progressively darker as the rainstorm that's moving across the prairie approaches. Even in the dead of winter, the only heat there ever is in this room comes through the ventilator in the floor. Voices also are carried by it. Though he can hear the conversation in the room below, he manages not to understand it.
What sounds like somebody moving furniture around is the first thunder, faint and far away. The water in the china pitcher comes from the cistern and is rainwater and rust-colored. He fills the bowl, and the water immediately turns cloudy into soap and dirt on his hands. From the room below, he hears, "Fortunately, I have witnesses." Him, among others. His mother has fits of weeping in the night. The walls are thin. Lying awake, he hears threats he tries not to believe and accusations he doesn't understand, and envies the dog who could put her head on her paws and go to sleep when she doesn't like the way things are. Raindrops spatter against the window pane, and he turns and looks out. The tops of the trees are swaying in the wind. The sky behind the windmill is a greenish, almost black, and his mother and Aunt Jenny, with their coats over their heads, are yanking the sheets from the line. There's a flash of lightning that makes everything in sight turn pale, and then deep, rolling thunder. He goes on, soaping his hands slowly, lost in a daydream about a motorcycle he has seen in the Sears Roebuck catalog. As Aunt Jenny is drawn toward the farm, so the hired man, Victor Jensen, feels the pull of town. Bright and early, on the morning of Decoration Day, he gets dressed up fit to kill and starts off down the highway. The same thing happens on the 4th of July and Labor Day. Though they know what he is heading for, they do not make any effort to stop him. It is his reward for not belonging to anybody and not having anybody who belongs to him. He isn't home by milking time, and they know then that he won't come home at all. In the morning, when they go to his room in the barn, his bed has not been slept in. Various neighbors report that they have seen him in town during the parade, or on the courthouse square, or at the band concert, reeling. 2 days later, a buggy drives up the lane and stops. Cletus comes to the door, and Lloyd Wilson says, "I passed Victor on the road just now. He was headed in this direction, and I tried to get him to climb in with me, but he wouldn't. I thought you'd like to know." Cletus and his father go out looking for the hired man and find him lying in a ditch a quarter of a mile from home, and put him to bed in his room in the barn. Except for the stench of alcohol on his breath and the dried vomit on his clothes, it is like undressing a child. The next day, he is up in time to help with the chores. He is deathly pale, and his hands shake. Nobody mentions his absence, and he is not apologetic, just withdrawn, as if he had answered a summons, and is in no way responsible for what followed. Another card. The cats run to greet Cletus when he walks into the barn. His father is already there milking Flossie, and Victor is milking the new cow. "Sorry I'm late," Cletus says, and picks up a milk bucket and a stool, and sits down beside old Bess. And then there are 3 of them going squirt, squirt, in approximately the same rhythm. He isn't as good a milker as his father, but nobody is. When his father was Cletus's age, he was milking 15 cows morning and night. The level of the milk rises slowly in the pails, and old Bess manages to hit him in the eye with her tail, as usual. "I thought I told you to come straight home from school." "Teacher kept me." "You've been causing trouble?" "I had to stay and make up an arithmetic test. I flunked it the first time." "Not what I sent you to school for." "I know." If Cletus didn't go to school at all, he wouldn't care. It is the way things are here that matters. He can't grow up fast enough. When he is grown, there won't be anything his father can do that he can't do. He is sitting at the kitchen table with his head bent over his arithmetic. He puts the end of his lead pencil in his mouth frequently, so the numbers will be black instead of gray. The darkness outside presses against the window panes, here also, but they are too accustomed to this to notice it. "I must go home," Mr. Wilson says, and doesn't. Except for the chores, all farming is at a standstill. Snow lies deep on the ground, and in much deeper drifts wherever it met with an obstruction. The wooden fence posts and the well roof are capped, and icicles hang from the gutters. His father and Mr. Wilson are talking about the relative merits of clover and alfalfa as a cover crop. Cletus would like to follow this conversation, but there are 12 problems, and he has only done half of them. "What's 9 times 7? He asks his mother, who tells him, and then rests her chin on Wayne's curls and utters a single word, "Bedtime." Wayne wants Cletus to go upstairs with him. "Why does he have to be such a baby? There's nothing upstairs that's going to hurt him." "Oh, be nice and go with him. You were afraid of the dark once. You just don't remember." So he closes his book and gets up from the table, though he hasn't finished the assignment, and Teacher will probably be sore at him. Teacher wasn't sore at him, as it turned out. She knows he is a gentle boy and tries hard. The rain is drumming on the tin roof of the shed off the kitchen where the separator is, and where Cletus's mother makes them keep their work shoes so they won't track the barnyard mud and manure into the house. He ties his shoelaces and makes a dash for it, with the dog bounding at his heels. When they arrive at the horse barn, his hair is plastered to his head, and his shirt is sticking to his back. The dog gets as close to him as she can, and then shakes herself. "Thanks. How'd you like it if I did that to you?" He doesn't really hold it against her, and she doesn't look guilty. They both know it is just something she has to do because she's a dog. It is warm and dry in the barn, and he soon stops shivering. He cleans out the stalls and puts down fresh hay for the horses and fills the water buckets, all the while enjoying the sight of the rain coming down on the plowed field beyond the open door. In the night, he gives Wayne a poke and says, "Move over. You're crowding me out of bed." Sometimes Cletus jabbers in his sleep. Mostly they lie curled together in what is not a very large bed, sleeping the sleep of stones. The north wind howling around the corner of the house only serves to deepen this unknowing. Dressing for church, Clarence Smith puts on a clean white shirt and discovers that Fern hasn't washed his collars and is angry with her. He has his duties to perform and she has hers, one of which is to see that he has clean clothes to put on. The small country church is packed with his neighbors, all of whom are wearing clean collars. The giving out of the hymn number causes them to rise and add the droning of their country voices to the wheezing of the little organ. Since the preacher said the point of the parables is mysterious and needs explaining, they have no choice but to believe him. The details, the great supper, the lost lamb, the unproductive vineyard, the unjust steward, the sower, and the seed sown secretly, they are familiar with and understand. Above the transparent dome they live and work under, there is another, even grander, where they will reside in mansions waiting to receive them when they are done with farming forever. What Clarence Smith sees as he helps his wife into the front seat of the buggy after church is a woman who in the sight of God is his lawfully wedded wife and owes him love, honor, and obedience. Other people, with nothing at stake, see that there is a look of sadness about her, as if she lives too much in the past, or perhaps expects more of life than is reasonable. Chapter 6. Lloyd Wilson's story. Though he had brothers he was on good terms with, the person he turned to for companionship, or when he had something weighing on his mind, was the overserious man in a neighboring farm. After 12 years, he found it hard to believe there had ever been a time when he and Clarence weren't friends. At night, in the immense darkness, the only light he could see came from the Smith's house. He remembered the day they came, a raw, wet, windy day in March. He was plowing next to the road when he saw an unfamiliar wagon piled high with stuff drive up the lane at Colonel Dowling's, and he threw the reins over the horse's neck and started across the fields. When he got to the house, the front door was unlocked and standing open, but the new neighbors were still outside, looking around to see where they were. The man, a little under average height, and a young woman with a baby. They'd been on the road since daybreak. They couldn't have been 30 yet, either of them, but already there were wrinkles in the man's forehead and at the corners of his eyes. His voice was low, and if he could indicate something by a gesture instead of speech, he did. And what crossed Lloyd Wilson's mind was how defenseless he seemed, saying, "Easy, easy, now your side. A little more, a little more." The two men maneuvered a heavy wardrobe up the stairs and through a narrow doorway. You didn't have to be much of a judge of character to see that the woman had been hoping for something better, and the man was being patient with her. She didn't seem to know what to do first. Brought up in town, he said to himself, and then, noticing how small her wrists were, "Here, ma'am, let me have that. It's too heavy for a woman to carry." As he handled their furniture, their crockery, and box after box of possessions they hadn't been able to part with, he found out things about them that first day that it would have taken him years to discover under ordinary circumstances. Poking the baby's stomach gently with his forefinger, he produced a smile. "Two of my own," he said as he turned away. He came upon the woman standing forlornly in the midst of a kitchen that had been stripped of everything, including the stove, and said, "My wife is expecting you folks for supper." She wasn't, but no matter. And anyways, they knew she couldn't be expecting them because nobody knew they were coming. When the others sat down to eat, Fern nursed her baby in the rocking chair in the parlor, and afterward he walked the new neighbors back to their house and waited till they had lit the lamps. In the county clerk's plat book, the 160 acres that Lloyd Wilson farmed were listed as belonging to Mrs. Mildred Stroud. It did not trouble him, or at least it did not trouble him very much, that the cows were his and the grass they cropped was not. The rent he had to pay on the pasture acreage was not unreasonable. His father had had the place before him, and had saved up enough money over the years so that when his health failed and he had to give up farming, he could live out his days in town. Mrs. Stroud was a woman in her early 50s with two unmarried daughters who lived at home, and were kept in the dark about her financial affairs, as she had been kept in the dark about her husband's, until he died suddenly, and the president of the bank began to explain things to her. He started in as though speaking to a child, and then had to pull himself up short. It has been his fixed opinion that all women are ignorant about money matters, But this woman didn't happen to be. And the questions she put to him were just the questions he would have preferred not to answer. It was quite impossible to take advantage of her. Inadvertent mistakes didn't escape her notice either. Like most extremely clever people, she underestimated the intelligence of others. She could have remarried, and chose not to because it would have meant discussing what she did with her money. She appeared at her farm frequently and without giving her tenant any warning. If she did that, what would have been the point in her coming? When she pitched into Lloyd Wilson for some piece of slackness, he cleared his throat and moistened his lips, as if he was about to argue with her, but instead he turned away, pretending that something a few feet to the right or left of him had engaged his attention at that moment. At other times, cap in hand, he was overly polite, in a way that could be taken for rudeness, but this she simply ignored. She knew, because she had made it her business to know everything about him, that if he hadn't got his corn in by the time he should have, it was probably because he was off planting somebody else's corn. Some neighbor who, because of sickness or whatever, wasn't able to do it himself. She could have made an issue of this and didn't. In the end, her corn got planted, and she was never actually out of pocket. It was the principle of the thing that she objected to. As her tenant, his first responsibility ought to be to her. If she didn't like the way he farmed, she could ask him to leave and put some other tenant on the place instead. But they both knew that this wasn't about to happen. The secret that Mildred Stroud managed to keep from him, though not from herself, was that she found him physically attractive. But she was 15 years older than he was, and knowing the cruelty of Lincoln gossip, didn't choose to be the subject of it. And anyway, it was out of the question. Chewing on a grass blade, he remarked, this was in the days when he and Clarence were still friends and he could say whatever came into his head, knowing it wouldn't be repeated or misunderstood. A good wife is a woman who's always tired, suffers from backache and headaches, and moves away from her husband in bed because she doesn't want any more children. And Clarence supposed that it wasn't just any good wife he was speaking of. What Lloyd Wilson didn't say, because there was nothing anybody could do about it anyway, and why should he burden Clarence with his trouble, if you could call it that, was that he didn't seem capable anymore of the kind of feelings he used to have. He was perfectly aware of his wife's good qualities. She worked like a slave from morning till night, holding up her end of things. She was a good mother. There was no question about any of this. Sometimes he thought it was just that they were so used to each other. He knew how she felt about almost everything, and most of the time what she was going to say before she said it. If they had been brother and sister, it wouldn't have been very different, except that she was jealous. If he so much as looked at another woman, she acted as if he'd done something unforgivable. Once or twice she worked herself up to such a pitch that she went upstairs and started packing. He knew that such persuasion as he could muster was half-hearted, and wouldn't convince her to change her mind. If she was bent on leaving him, there was nothing he could do about it. She didn't leave him. She only threatened to. None of those women meant anything to him, he said. And with her face averted, she said, the trouble is, I don't mean anything to you either. Whether he himself would have come to this conclusion if she hadn't embarrassed him by putting it into words, he couldn't say. All he knew was he wished she hadn't said it. He was ready to provide for her and to treat her with respect, but he couldn't work up a semblance of the emotion that would have made her happy. Between these crises, they lived like any other married couple. You could not have told from her voice as she said, I'm about to put things on the table, Lloyd, or his voice as he said, pass the salt and pepper, please, if there was anything wrong. He wondered if other men felt the same way about their wives, or if it was just him. He was almost 40 years old, and lately it had seemed to him that he had lived a long time, and that just about everything that could happen to him had happened. When his evening chores were done, he walked over the hill, and leaning against the post in the cow barn, directed a steady stream of conversation at the back of Clarence's head. When Clarence and Victor carried the milk to the shed off the kitchen where the separator was, he followed them, and from there into the house, anything to keep from going home. Sometimes he told himself he ought not to go to the Smiths so often. He was afraid of becoming a nuisance, and still not quite able to stay away. One night, sitting in their kitchen, he tried to tell them how much their friendship meant to him, and then broke off in embarrassment, because anything he might say seemed so much less than he felt. "You don't have to tell us," Fern said, smiling at him. "And anyway, it isn't as one-sided as you appear to think." Then she changed the subject. He sat back, glad that he had spoken, and glad she had stopped him from going on. He also recognized that what she said wasn't just politeness. They were themselves in front of him, as if he had assured them, he hadn't, but it was nevertheless true, that he didn't expect them to be anything they weren't. All this was altered irrevocably by a change in him so unexpected that it was as if it had happened without his knowing a thing about it. And after that, he could not go on being natural in front of them. He said silently, but nevertheless wanting to be heard, "Clarence, you ought not to trust me," half expecting Clarence to answer, "Why not?" If Clarence had, then he would have said, "Because all my life I've been a stranger to myself." He hated himself for being weak, for having no will, but it wasn't that he didn't try to overcome the feelings he knew he shouldn't have. Time after time, he thought he had overcome them, and it always turned out that he hadn't. Excuses to pay a visit to the barns, where she wouldn't be, so there was no harm in it, or to the house, where she would be, occurred to him constantly. He would reject 4 in a row and find himself hurriedly acting on the 5th. His feet took him there, without his consent. He might as well have given in the first place. Searching for a clue to her feelings, he was alert to the quality of her voice when she spoke to her children or to Clarence. He knew when she was depressed. He knew also that, like most married people, she and Clarence quarreled sometimes. Did he imagine it, or was it true that they got on better with each other and were more cheerful when he was around? If he did what he knew he ought to do, which was not to go there any more, Clarence would wonder why. So would she. The idea that she would think of him at all pleased him. All day long he thought about her. The cows sensed that he hardly knew what he was doing, and turned their heads as far as their stanchions would permit, and looked at him gravely. He sighed, and then a moment later sighed again, deep sighs that seemed to come from as far down as they could come. To have escaped from that deadness, from the feeling that all he had to look forward to was more of the same. But he was careful. He didn't make a simple remark without rehearsing it beforehand. And he continually removed the expression from his face lest it be the wrong one and give him away. He also avoided any strong light, such as the lamp on the kitchen table. Sometimes a weakness overcame him. His legs were unstrung, and he had to find some place to sit down. But this was easy enough to disguise. It was his voice that gave him the most trouble. It sounded false to him, and not like his voice at all.